Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Myah and this is Inspired by Myah. So in today's video, we're going to be making a ruched summer two-piece, yeah. So it's a ruched top and a ruched skirt. It's really easy to sew up, like so beginner friendly, it's unreal. You could probably sew it up in like 1 to 2 hours. The pattern is available on my Etsy page if you wanted to download it. The link will be in the description box down below. But yeah, I'm not going to ramble on for too long, so let's get into the tutorial. So you know the drill. I started off with a rough design idea, and this set is the easiest thing to sew, so it's defo beginner friendly. It only has a couple of seams, so it sews up pretty fast as well, and the pattern is very adaptable. You don't have to ruche the fabric, it can be left plain and simple, or you can ruche the sides instead of the front, etc. I would say it's a perfect summer pattern. For my fabric, I'm using brown elastane. It's really stretchy. I believe it's a 4-way stretch. So I just placed my pieces on the fold and carefully cut around them. Stretchy fabric can be a little bit harder to cut just because it moves so much, so you may want to pin it in place before you cut it. For the skirt, you should have 2 pieces cut on the fold. I also put a pin in the center front where the notch is for the ruching, just so that I know exactly where to put my elastic later. Now, because we're using a stretchy fabric, we need to make sure that the settings on our machine are correct. So you need to change your needle to a stretch needle, and because we're using a stretchy fabric, we need to use a zigzag stitch. Now, if your machine has a few more stitches available, it may have this lightning bolt looking stitch which mimics a straight stitch but still keeps the stretch factor as it zigzags, just not as wide as a normal zigzag. Before you start sewing your real thing, always test it on a small piece of the fabric you're working with. As you can see, my sample held up really well. I was stretching it to the maximum stretch it could take and the seam was very strong. To measure my elastic, I just took a piece and stretched it to the length that I wanted it to be, so I kind of got to see how much the fabric gathers to kind of weigh up where I wanted to cut it, and then I just snipped it there. I also did the same for the back, but I made the back a little bit longer than the front. But if I was to make this again, I actually wouldn't ruche the back just because I prefer it only at the front. So to start sewing the elastic on, I pinned it in place at the center front and at the place where I marked the ruching notch with the pin. Then I put the fabric under the machine and turned the needle so it was inserted into the elastic and the fabric. A little tip to make sewing elastic on easier is to make sure that you have the threads hanging so that you can pull on it when you start sewing. Because of the stretch factor of elastic, it can tend to be difficult to sew forward as it wants to snap back to its original form. Then you just want to sew that with a lightning bolt stitch from the top to the end of the pin. Make sure you stretch it while you're sewing and try and keep it in as straight as a line as possible. And this is what it should look like. Now for the side seams, just place your fabric together right sides facing and sew with your seam allowance and the lightning stitch all the way down the sides of the skirt. If you want, you can overlock this seam, but I need to fix the settings of my overlocker because it doesn't create a solid seam, so I just decided to use my sewing machine. Now piece the top pieces together right sides facing and sew a stitch on the side seams, so you should end up with 2 tops, a shorter one and a longer one. Then place the smaller top inside the longer top right sides facing and match up your side seams. I like to make my seam allowance go in opposite directions so that it lies flat. Then you want to pin all around the top of the top and sew all around. Then flip the top right sides facing out. Now it is optional and I didn't end up doing it, but I probably would next time, and that is to top stitch the seam allowance towards the lining side of the top so it prevents it from rolling over as you wear it. Now we can do the ruching for the center front of the top. Exactly how we did the skirt, you want to sew the elastic on to the lining side of the fabric, so it should be sitting on top of 2 layers of fabric. Now to stop the lining from coming out, you want to tack the sides down to the side seams of the top. I just pinned the lining to the side seam with the seam allowances in opposite directions again so that it lies flat. Then I pinned it in place and did a stitch in the ditch, which is just sewing right in the center of the seam so it's essentially invisible. With stretchy fabrics, it's a bit more forgiving, so as you're sewing you can stretch it, and then when you release the stretch it kind of swallows the stitch. For the waistband, I'm using fold over elastic. You want to wrap it around your waist and snip where it's comfortable with about 1 centimeter for overlapping it to form a loop. Then pin it right sides facing the waist. Whenever you're sewing elastic in a loop, quarter your circumference. So first I pin it to a seam, then fold the garment in half and find the half point of the elastic, match them up and then repeat for the other sides. This just ensures the stretch is evenly distributed around the garment. You don't want it to be more gathered in one place than the other. Next, sew that on with a lightning bolt stitch. Fold it towards the inside of the garment and sew on the right side of the fabric to stitch it in place. Now you should have a clean waistband.